This video was made with the help of the Magistral Library and Archives of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Thank you to them for their help in our research. How can a country exist without territory? The definitions of a country vary, but almost all of them agree on one aspect. A country is a nation with its own government, occupying a particular territory. For Switzerland, we all know this territory is here in Europe. For Bhutan, we all recognize this area of Asia. But in the list of countries in the world, there is one that stands out precisely for not possessing any territory: the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And this strikes us as immediately strange. After all, Malta is in its name a set of islands in the middle of the Mediterranean. But Malta is its own separate country. So how does this work? Why does the military order have Malta in its name but doesn't exist in its territory? Well, it all has to do with the history of the order, which is reflected in its full and official name, the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, because throughout its history, the order existed in all of these and some other territories. Malta was its final official territory, and so it remains today as the name for which they are usually known, despite the fact they only now exist in a couple of buildings in Rome, Italy, which enjoy extraterritoriality similar to what embassies have. In this video, we're going to learn two things. First, what the history of the order is, how it was created, what its purpose initially was, and how they evolved throughout history, moving throughout all of these territories. And second, what the order is like today, how it exists, what it does, how its purpose and work have evolved, and what life is like in and for the only country in the world that has no territory. So, when did the order start and where? Despite existing today as a territorialist country, it's also one of the oldest continuously existing countries in the world, with over 970 years of history. Upon its creation, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta was known differently as the Knights Hospitaller, also having a fuller title of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, taking its name in honor of John the Baptist, a biblical figure. The birth of this order dates to the year 1048 and is precisely connected to Jerusalem in Palestine. Merchants from the ancient Marine Republic of Amalfi in Italy obtained permission from the Caliph of Egypt, who at the time ruled the region, to build a church, a convent, and a hospital in the city to care for the pilgrims of any religion who visited the holy city. In fact, their name comes precisely from the Old French hospitalier, one devoted to the care of the sick and needy in hospitals. A few years later, in 1113, the creation of the order was approved by Pope Pascal II, turning the hospital into a sovereign order under the protection of the papacy and independent from the control of local churches. With the power to elect its own leaders, this could arguably be defined as the moment where the order attained its independence and sovereignty, which lasts until today. This recognition seems to also be connected with the establishment of the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem, created after the First Crusade. With its transformation into an order within the Christian kingdom, they took the role of military defense of pilgrims and the territory itself. It was at this point that the Hospitallers saw the prefix title of knight added to their name. As time went on, the order adopted the white 8-pointed cross that is still its symbol today. The 8 points represent the 8 beatitudes that Jesus supposedly pronounced in his Sermon on the Mount, although their flag today is a simple white cross on a red field. The early existence of the order thus became associated with the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem. The current director of communications of the order, Eugenio Airoldi di Robiat, provided these fantastic depictions of Jerusalem at the time when the order existed there. It's incredible to see the detail in the walls, which along with the order protected the city, as well as many of its buildings and outer towers and fortresses. The second map provides us with a more detailed view of the city's streets and landmarks, with special attention to the mount next to the city, likely the one represented on their symbol. The mention of the walls in the defense of the city is important because the Knights Hospitaller were partially tasked with this defense too, even if indirectly, through their defense of the pilgrims. Another military order existed in the city, the famous Knights Templar, and at times the two rivaled in their positions and supported opposite sides in disputes. Jerusalem fell in 1187 and the Knights were forced to leave the city, finding themselves confined to the county of Tripoli, the last of the Crusader states. And when all of the Holy Land was retaken by Muslim powers, an event that is often marked with the loss of the last Christian stronghold, Acre, in 1291, the order sought refuge in the nearby kingdom of Cyprus, at the time ruled by the French house of Lusignan, and so a Christian kingdom that would likely welcome them. Finding themselves too tangled in complicated Cypriot politics and finding no purpose for their order there, they created a plan of acquiring their own domain, choosing the nearby island of Rhodes, which was then part of the Byzantine Empire. In 1310, they executed their plan, and after 4 years, the city of Rhodes surrendered to the Knights, who also took control of a number of neighboring islands and the Anatolian port of Halikarnassus, as well as the island of Castellorizo. The Hospitaller Knights of Jerusalem now had become the Hospitaller Knights of Rhodes, and this marks the moment when they were not only just a sovereign military order, but a state or country entirely. Becoming a state, they adopted the features of one. The hierarchy of the order was transferred to the state, with the highest figure of government being the Grand Master, ruling together with the order's council. They began minting their own currency and maintaining diplomatic relations with other states. It was also at this time that the order organized its members into a more solid structure, dividing the knights into tongues, which did not confine them to which kingdoms in Europe they were from, but rather to which language they spoke, sort of a ethno-linguistic division. There were initially 7 languages: Provence, Auvergne, France, Italy, Aragon, England, and Germany. In 1462, Castile and Portugal split off from the Langue of Aragon and constituted the 8th. Each was administered by a prior or a grand prior. Not long after, in 1312, Pope Clement V dissolved the Hospitaller's rival order, the Knights Templar, with a series of papal bulls that turned over much of their property to the Hospitallers. Having conquered a land of their own, establishing an official state, organizing their hierarchy, and receiving this support from the papacy, the Knights Hospitaller were becoming a force to be reckoned with in medieval Europe, one which, from its beginning, had their independence from other nations granted by pontifical charter, which is important because their independence wasn't granted by an agreement between other nations, and this contributed to the fact that they were able to keep it throughout history. In Rhodes, the order's military features were forced to be increased as the Byzantines attempted to retake the island, namely in 1334, even extending their military reach into neighboring areas, for instance in the defense of Smyrna on the Anatolian coast in 1374, attempting to protect the city which had been conquered by the Crusaders 30 years earlier. In the 15th century, the Knights fought frequently with Barbary pirates, and they withstood 2 invasions by Muslim forces, one led by the Sultan of Egypt in 1444, and another by Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror in 1480, who, after conquering Constantinople and defeating the Byzantine Empire in 1453, made the Knights a priority target. Their bravery and dedication allowed them to resist for long, but not forever. In 1522, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, arguably the greatest sultan of the Ottoman Empire, led 100,000 soldiers and 400 ships to Rhodes, determined to conquer the island from the Hospitallers. The Knights were well fortified, but their numbers were vastly smaller, fielding only 7,000 men. They resisted for 6 months until surrendering after the Sultan's clever use of explosives to destroy the city walls, retreating to the island of Sicily in Italy, a noble defeat which could only have been avoided by a miracle. They remained in refuge in Sicily for some years until 1530, when Pope Clement VII, who himself was a member of the Knights Hospitaller Order, reached an agreement with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain and Sicily, to provide the Knights with a permanent territory. It seems the constant proximity of the order with the papacy from its earliest days was a big advantage, a powerful ally which allowed them to survive what would likely be the moment of destruction for any other state. Charles V agreed to grant the Malta archipelago as well as the North African port of Tripoli in modern Libya to the Hospitallers in perpetuity, although somewhat in a feudal status to the Kingdom of Sicily, which he ruled. In return, he asked only for a yearly payment of a single Maltese falcon, their currency, sort of as a symbolic tribute. Although there were other terms to the agreement, they had to sign a non-aggression pact with Sicily, they couldn't grant immunity to fugitives, they could not transfer the land to anyone else, among other details. Charles V was not, I believe, a member of the order, but he seemed pretty close and friendly to them. In 1548, as Holy Roman Emperor, he raised Itersheim, the headquarters of the Hospitallers in Germany, into a principality, making the Hospitaller Grand Prior of Germany a prince of the Holy Roman Empire with a seat and a vote in the Reichstag. And their influence in Europe was even vaster. Giovanni Francisco Abella, a 17th century noble and author, claimed that following the Battle of Verbia in 1561, the order gained a puppet state in Moldova until 1563. This is somewhat disputed, but one thing becomes clear. Hospitaller influence and importance across Europe was significant, even at the highest level. And so the Knights Hospitaller, first of Jerusalem, then of Cyprus, then of Rhodes, now became the Knights Hospitaller of Malta and Tripoli. Their rule over Tripoli was short. Arriving in 1530, they only held control of the port city until 1551, when it was taken once again by the Ottoman Empire. The Knights were limited in manpower, and it seems it was difficult for them to hold control of both Tripoli and Malta. When given the choice of prioritizing one of them, they naturally chose Malta, which may have contributed to the quick loss of Tripoli. In 1553, Charles V also offered a third possession to them, the city of Media in modern Tunisia. However, the order refused to take control of the city since they decided it would be too expensive to maintain. Although they were granted the islands in 1530, it is said the true settling of Malta by the order only began in 1565 after their impressive victory over the Ottomans in the Great Siege of Malta. It was literally a rematch. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was the same one who had kicked them out of Rhodes, and they had previously attempted to take Malta in 1551, failing then. In 1565, they returned with a larger army, and the Knights Hospitaller, numbering only 500 with 6,000 foot soldiers at their command, were able to repel an Ottoman force of around 40,000. The Hospitallers had some help. Among those 6,000 soldiers were men of the Spanish Empire, Sicily, Genoa, Savoy, Florence, and the Papal States, essentially the local Christian forces who came to their aid given the Muslim religion of the Ottoman invaders. But their victory was incredible. It became one of the most celebrated events of 16th century Europe. French philosopher Voltaire is often quoted as having said, "Nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta." In his painting, glorifying the victors, we can see the banner of the order being waved, as well as the white cross on a red field. This victory also contributed to destroying the perception of Ottoman invincibility and opened the door to the dispute of sea control over the Mediterranean between Christian kingdoms and the Ottoman's fleet, a decades-long conflict in which the Knights of Malta continued to take part in, both in sea battles and in land ones, such as the Battle of Djerba in 1560, which the Ottomans won, or the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where the self-named Holy League was victorious. After being victorious in the Great Siege of Malta, the order decided to permanently settle in the island and began to construct a new capital city, Valletta, which remains the capital of Malta today. For the next 2 centuries, the island went through a golden age with flourishing arts, architecture, culture, military, among others. They further fortified the island and its grand harbor and expanded their fleet to a reasonable size. In fact, it seems corsairing was a big part of their economy until the early 1700s. In this painting, we can see a Hospitaller galleys capturing an Ottoman ship. But they also did something even more impressive with this fleet. You see, in the mid-17th century, they became the smallest state to colonize the Americas. In 1651, they acquired 4 islands in the Caribbean: St. Barthélemy, St. Christopher, St. Croix, and St. Martin, buying them from France, but ending up selling them back in 1665. And the reason why they were able to acquire these colonies was a proof of their vast influence and presence in other European kingdoms. You see, the Knights of Malta had a strong presence within many of Europe's military forces, namely within the Russian Imperial Navy, but also that of France. Philippe de Poissy was a knight, and he was appointed by the French as governor of their colony of St. Kitts. It was through his proximity with the French crown that the order was able to purchase and temporarily rule these Caribbean islands. It's even said that they only sold them due to de Poissy's death. And it's amazing how this small country was able to venture out into colonies, even if unsuccessfully, due to their influence. Back in Malta, growth and development continued, and what's curious about the order's government structure is that despite its territory now being in Malta, the elected Grand Master didn't need to be Maltese. Knights Hospitaller came from all over Europe, and any of the languages could see one of its knights elected. In the 18th century, for instance, they had 2 Portuguese grandmasters who brought great Baroque influence to the island's architecture. This multiculturalism, bringing together people from all over Europe, must have contributed immensely to a fantastic diversity in the island's culture, art, and construction styles. This had a negative side, at least at first. The locals of the island didn't see the arrival of the order with good eyes. The first knights were French, and Maltese natives were, at least at first, not allowed to join the order, something that also explains why French was the official language of the island for a long time. The Golden Age, however, could not and did not last forever. In 1753, Grand Master Pinto proclaimed the sovereignty of the Order of Malta, and a dispute started with the Kingdom of Sicily, and they arguably achieved a de facto full sovereignty. This was, however, a short-lived victory. In the last 3 decades of the 18th century, the order experienced a steady decline, mostly the result of the bankruptcy caused by the Grand Master's irresponsible expenses. Not helping the island's economy, the locals began disliking the order, even attempting some small revolts. To add to their problems, their influence in Europe seemed to diminish as they lost many of the order's branches due to the Protestant Reformation, losing all properties in England in 1540 precisely due to this, and in 1792 the order's possessions in France, some of them still perhaps dating back to that transfer from the Pope when the Templars were abolished, were seized by the state due to the French Revolution, which led the already bankrupt order into an even greater financial crisis. This was, however, not the worst thing that would come to the order from the French Revolution. In 1798, on his way to his famous expedition in Egypt, Napoleon captured the stronghold of Malta. It is said that they could have chosen to withstand a longer siege and wait out to see what happened, but faced with the vastly superior French forces and almost immediate loss of Western Malta, the Grand Master negotiated a surrender. The French occupied Malta until 1800, then being ousted by the locals with the aid of the British, but the order had already been forced to leave. And despite the Treaty of Amiens, which followed the War of the Second Coalition, determining the order was to be reinstated as rulers, this did not happen. After surrendering to the French, the knights dispersed. Though the order continued to exist throughout Europe, it did so in a diminished form. Their influence was much smaller, both a consequence of their defeat and internal decline, but also a combination of circumstances, namely the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution. It was in Russia that they found refuge, when Russian Emperor Paul I gave the largest number of knights shelter in St. Petersburg. And in fact, the Tsar was elected Grand Master of the Order, something that was never made official due to the dissatisfaction of the Roman Catholic branches of the Knights. From 1798, they remained in St. Petersburg for a while, and Russia gained an enormous importance to the functioning of the order, accounting for 90% of its funding at the time. In 1806, the Swedish government offered the sovereignty of the island of Gotland to the order. This would mean what they had wanted, a return to a territory fully under their own control. However, they inexplicably said no. The justification was that in order to accept, they would have to renounce their claim to Malta, and perhaps they still had hope of returning. Why the Swedish bothered to even offer Gotland is something that I could not find. However, in 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna forced them to abdicate their claim on Malta anyway, and the offer for Gotland was gone, leaving them without a territory of their own. Moving back into Western and Southern Europe, although many of the knights remained in Russia, the order temporarily resided in Messina, Catania, and Ferrara by 1826, then moving their official residence to Rome in 1834, establishing themselves in the order's former embassy to the Papal States, the Magistral Palace in Via Condotti, and the Magistral Villa on the Aventine Hill, both of them in Rome. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII restored the office of Grand Master, which had been vacant for around 75 years, roughly since the death of Tsar Paul. This signaled the renewal of the order's fortunes as a humanitarian and religious organization close to the head of the Catholic Church and somewhat returning to the Papal State's historic protection. However, they maintained their sovereignty with their new headquarters in Rome, enjoying extraterritoriality status. Think of it as the same way the Vatican exists inside Rome, they do too, except they're even smaller than that, being reduced to 2 palaces. The loss of territory necessarily meant a loss of their military capabilities, and so the original Hospitaller mission became the main activity of the order once again, humanitarian aid, with the added element of diplomatic relations that they had achieved and maintained throughout all of their existence. Today, the order has formal diplomatic relations with 111 states, having embassies in many of them, with countries also nominating their ambassadors to the order, usually coinciding with their ambassador to the Vatican. In this map, we can see which those are in red and orange. They maintain a special relation with the modern Republic of Malta, having shared their territory for so long. They also have observer status at the General Assembly of the United Nations and continue to issue their own stamps, passports, license plates, and currency, although the latter mostly for collectors. Their humanitarian missions have grown throughout the years, existing in over 120 countries, one of which is precisely their cooperation and funding of the St. John's Eye Hospital in Jerusalem. Their self-proclaimed goal is to work towards the sick, the needy, and people without a country, without distinction of religion, race, sex, origin, and age. Tuitio fidei et obsequium pauperum, to bear witness to the faith and assist the poor and sick, is the Latin motto that has ruled the members of the Order of Malta for almost 1,000 years, and their only remaining military force is now incorporated in the Italian military as a medical unit. During the Great War, they assisted over 800,000 wounded on both fronts. During World War II, they ran hospitals, health centers, and first aid posts in many European countries. Thereafter, they contributed in post-war reconstruction in the Balkans and Iraq, and they helped refugees from internal conflicts in Syria, Colombia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, currently providing further aid in Ukraine, Yemen, and many other countries facing conflicts. The Sovereign Order of Malta occupies a special place in international law. It's not a state because it no longer has a territory nor citizens, but it's also not an international organization. It is still usually recognized as a sovereign country, and their internal structure remains the same. They have their own constitution, an independent magistracy, tribunals, a head of state, the Grand Master, and a government, the Sovereign Council. In February of 2013, the order celebrated the 900th anniversary of its papal recognition, and they continue to exist today as such, a country without territory, but with a tremendously interesting history throughout many territories that they once called their own. Thanks so much for watching this video. Let me know in the comments if you have any additional information or corrections about this topic. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.